Emotional algebra, where the heart meets the math. What is integral is derivative as you figure out your path. Power plus emotions equals more than you can see. Listening to the wisdom of our host, Dr.
Welcome to Emotional Algebra with Dr. E. We're here to help you understand the relationship between the variables we use in our daily lives that contribute to our interactions with others, all with the goal of becoming better human beings. I'm Andrew Tavani, your co-host.
And I'm Dr. E.
Dr. E, in the first couple of episodes of Emotional Algebra, you introduced some new concepts to people: models of power, the hierarchical model of power, the equity model of power. Interesting stuff. Today, we're going to go much deeper into some of these concepts and build on them. Tell us about what viewers and listeners can expect today.
Well, today, again, we're going to go into talking about the idea of dichotomies and how they work in the world we live in. And again, what's the adaptability of using these dichotomies, which are basically, a dichotomy literally means the state of cutting things into two if we break that word down into its Greek and Latin roots. We'll get into that in a little bit. But what I wanted to start with was going back and just doing a quick overview of what we talked about in the first two episodes, because this is important to understanding, again, the concept of dichotomies here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one thing, Dr. E, which I love, is the visuals. So I know you're going to show the viewers and listeners, and if you're only listening, it's great to actually tune in and watch, because Dr. E's got some great visuals here that help really crystallize all this stuff and help you visualize it well.
Absolutely. So where we begin is the idea of what the hierarchical model of power is. And as we're showing it on the screen, I have 5 circles, each one bigger and or smaller than the next. And we're basically building this idea that everybody has a different model, a different level of power. And what we're supposed to do is figure out how we get power in that model first. And so often what we try to do is we undermine or we mess with other people's power, we usurp or directly challenge them, or we look to people in positions higher or lower to promote us or demote us up and down that system of power. As we get into that, then what we start to figure out is, well, how do I ever learn to believe in myself if I'm letting other people define my power and worth for me? And this is a question that a lot of people really might want to ask themselves, but they don't realize how much our power is defined by outside sources. The next piece was looking at the questions that we might ask ourselves. Which circle or sphere of power do I want to be? That's our ideal. So where do we want to be seen in that hierarchy? The next question is, which circle do I feel like? That's my feel reference of power. Often there are big discrepancies between somebody's ideal or how they want to be seen and their feel and how they feel inside. The last question is, how do other people see me? And that's what I call the real self. The real self can change. It's variable often. Our ideal self is usually pretty stable, or the way we want to be seen. And our feel can be variable depending on if we're at work or with family or friends or different situations. But we're often going to be trying to manipulate our ideal and real to try to affect our feel inside. And understanding those three is really critical, because when we start to understand the disparity between those, then we can really start to understand why we do what we do. And we're no different than many other people. So we're going to fall into some of those same patterns as well.
So a lot of new terms that people could apply to the things they observe in their daily lives. And I hope people have been doing the homework that you assigned in the last episode, which is to observe these things in your daily life, in your interactions, and mostly as you said, most people are socialized into the hierarchical model of power, but there's also the equity model of power. So let's review that for a second.
Well, that idea of equity is that we all have the potential for the same model, same level of power. It's an aspirational model, but it's also one that I say that kids are born with the concept of equity and socialized into hierarchy. So a lot of people wonder, well, are you saying my kid has the same amount of power as me, or that my boss had the same amount of power as me, or I have the same amount of power as other people around me? It's not about being same. It's about equity and balance. It's about finding our equity through our different gifts, strengths, weaknesses, handicaps, wisdom, experience, knowledge, and understanding. So as we find that balance and equity, we grow into our gifts and we ameliorate our weaknesses through the gifts that we have. So there are people who are born leaders. And it doesn't mean they're more or less important than anybody else. Typically, we see them as more important in a hierarchical model, and we give them command over people. But it's about their ability to leverage people's skill sets and to help motivate people and to bring people and ideas together. So that's when I want to recognize that. As well, we have people who are gifted artists, people who are gifted in math and quantum physics and helping us understand our universe. People who are gifted people and helping people understand their spiritual connections. So as we see that and we start to acknowledge each other's abilities and gifts, we can start to have power with people versus the hierarchical model where we typically seek power over people. The key to the differences between these models is what are the emotions that drive each model? The emotions that drive the hierarchical model are fear. Everybody in that model feels fear. Why? Because the little circle feels afraid that the bigger circles may hurt them, harm them, control them, undermine them, or take their power, keep their power. And they also feel afraid so that they need the people above them to take care of them, to help support them, to give them what they need because they don't believe they can take care of themselves. The second person up feels fear for the same reasons as the first one, but also then has to watch his back and fear the other ones undermining them or usurping them. And it moves all the way up the system. For a better review of this, I'd encourage you all to listen to the first episode and the second episode to really get the full picture of this. The equity model is based in love. And that idea of love is that if we learned and we come into this world learning to love and respect ourselves, we will love and respect other people. So what we're talking about is the idea of a difference between a fear-based respect, that I'll respect you as long as I feel afraid of you, as long as you can take stuff from me, as long as you can hurt me, harm me, control me. But what happens when I don't feel fear anymore? I don't respect you. I don't have to do what you say. Look at what happens in our families. Look at what happens in our communities. When we start to take fear, which is often used as a weapon of control, and then we don't feel it anymore. That's why typically we're seeking power over. In equity and a love-based respect, it's the golden rule of do unto others as I would have you do unto you. Or, I'm going to treat you how I want to be treated. So in that, we've heard that before, and it's talked about that Jesus taught that, but it's pretty much a very central spiritual teaching centered to a lot of different religions. So the thing we want to see in that is what are we teaching our kids and what have we adopted over generations ourselves and what might really be in our best interest? What might help to resolve conflicts versus continue to feed conflicts? And that's where it's important to get into the concept of dichotomies.
Okay, Dr. E, that's a great recap of everything we've covered. Like you said, important to go back if you haven't seen it, rewatch those episodes, watch them the first time. But let's talk about the dichotomies. Another new concept here that I feel like people may not be thinking about on a conscious level. Maybe subconsciously this exists somewhere. But let's dive into it and let's understand how they influence our actions with others.
Right, absolutely. So I think the thing that I see is in this hierarchical model that there are four basic dichotomies that operate in that model. And those four dichotomies are strong versus weak, good versus bad, right versus wrong, and win versus lose. And when we start to look at how our world operates and we see how we use those different dichotomies in different situations, or different people tend to use them use one more than others, or combinations thereof, then we start to understand how part of our dynamic and our interaction in the world is formed. What I often talk about with people is the idea that our dichotomies tend to be part of our temperament. And this isn't part of that hierarchical use of that dichotomy. It's that sometimes people come to this world as more strong-willed. Sometimes people come to this world more as wanting to be seen as good. They tend to be people pleasers. Sometimes people are born or little, kids, we see them as at younger age, and as they continue to grow, needing to and feeling like they want to be right all the time. These evoke different conflicts, and the way we respond to those conflicts often is going to lead to patterns that we have depending on even how the world responds to us. So the key here is the interaction between that dichotomy of temperament, as I call it, and our interaction in the world, and how that might affect our dichotomy of choice. So what do I mean by dichotomy of choice? What I'm talking about there is that idea that sometimes people get socialized into using a secondary dichotomy or another dichotomy, in other words. So let's say you have a kid who's born strong-willed. My daughter was always very strong-willed from a very young age. And what would happen is she'd want to get her way. And in wanting to get her way, it's not that she wanted to get her way and have power over us. She just was like, no, this is what I want. This is what I want to do. And then depending on how the world responded to her, then she would respond back, either in learning to compromise and find compromise, or realize she wasn't going to get all that she wanted, or finding those pockets of people, individuals, groups, places where she could use that idea to get power over, to get what she wanted. And then some of the problems would ensue, whether it was at her Montessori school or with certain caretakers she had, or situations. So the situation was over time, she began to be socialized into wanting to be stronger than, versus just naturally expressing her desire to be strong. Then as she entered middle school and struggles ensued, then she started to switch that, because she realized she just couldn't continue to express her strengths with her peers. It wasn't working the same way. So she had to learn to adapt. And in those times was a time of disruption. It was a time that she had to figure that out. And in high school now, she's learned how to find balance and express that strength, her inner power, her light, as I say, in a way that to me works with people rather than having power over people. And that kind of came full circle from how she came to the world, how she was socialized into it, now how she's finding herself through the help that we've offered and the help that we've supported her with, because we do talk a lot as parents and with our daughter.
So not everyone has Dr. E at home as their dad to talk about these sort of things, or to think them through. As I'm looking at this visual, Dr. E, I'm wondering, is this healthy? Is it functional? I can think of certain contexts in which it would most definitely be functional, especially win versus lose in a sports context where the whole purpose is predicated on somebody needs to win and somebody needs to lose, but not everything is so cut and dry in life. Right. Does this really work?
Well, and here what you're looking at is how we use them. So many times we seek to have, again, that idea of power over, that am I better than you? Am I stronger than you? Am I more right than you? And often what that does is, we're in creating those dichotomies, we're squelching other people or stepping on them. And we teach them, well, you got to be strong. You got to persevere through that. And I don't believe that. I think that we will find our way, and we'll find our way through that together with people. So in the idea of expressing strength, or, in having to be stronger than people, I think we want to look at the idea of, can I have power and express my strength with people? Does there always have to be a loser? I used to coach soccer from kids from 5 years old all the way. I ended up coaching all the way up through 15, 16 years old. At the early ages, I was always careful when kids would come up at the end of the game and say, did we win? I'd say, did you have fun? And they said, yeah. I said, then we all won. So early ages, in order to build confidence, you don't necessarily want to make it about winning versus losing. If you lose, you're supposed to feel bad. You want to inspire a sense of intrinsic motivation. There's extrinsic motivation, which external factors are supposed to help motivate you to do things. And intrinsic motivation is that you feel good about something. You feel self-motivated. You do something out of self-respect, or because you're part of something even greater. It teaches teamwork and collaboration, rather than pointing out, you're the kid, you stink, and you're the one who, we don't want on our team. That's where that comes from. 70% of kids roughly get out of organized sports by middle school times because they've lost their fun because of that pressure of win versus lose. Then they don't exercise, they lack activity, they're not gaining those coordination skills. So they're not getting some of that other areas of support and help that they need in life to really build a more well-rounded life as they grow older. And then these emotions that are associated with them, failure, shame, guilt, and how we look at them in our culture as bad and wrong and weak. That's another thing that really makes, to me, these dichotomies and the way we use them dysfunctional and really destructive. Because if we look at the dichotomies and we identify ourselves through good and bad and right and wrong and strong and weak and to get to win and lose, then what we're going to do is we're going to also identify our emotions through those same lenses. What emotions look good and or strong and or right, and which ones look bad and wrong and weak. And I think if we really took a list, I always tell people I have a list of 260 emotions in my office. And when I go through that list with them, often they find that there are many, many, many more emotions. It's probably like an 8 or 9 to 1 ratio of emotions that are seen as bad and or wrong and or weak to those that are seen as good or strong or right. And even those emotions that can be seen as good or strong or right can still be flipped and be seen as bad or wrong or weak in different situations.
So it's really about perception, I think, is what you're saying there to some degree. Also, as you're talking about the sports thing, I was using that as an example of where it might be a cut and dry concept, but maybe it's not so cut and dry, at least with younger kids, as you were talking about there. At what point do you think people should start thinking about winning when it comes to sports?
Well, I think it's how we focus on winning. For example, I play games with kids all the time. I play chess, and I talk about the way they approach life. I talk about chess really being a team sport, not an individual sport, because you have a team and you're the coach of that team. All those pieces are your players, and you have to know how each player works. So even when you're a coach and you're working with your team, and now we're getting beyond chess, some players are motivated by really challenging with that idea of, are you really giving it your best? And and see that dude, he's your opponent and you have to go ahead and destroy him. And, some people are motivated by that. Other people feel intimidated by that. So if we only look at the world through the lens of our own eyes, and we only coach, teach, parent, manage only in one way, and that's the way we see the world, we're going to potentially lose people, alienate them, intimidate them, or they might start walking all over us because they see the world in a different way that they want to try to affect and express themselves, most likely through their dichotomy of choice and or dichotomy of temperament. So I'm always asking people every day, look at the dichotomy you're basically expressing to the world at that time and ask yourself why. Where does that come from? How does that variable play into your emotional algebra? Where and when does that dichotomy of choice versus or dichotomy of temperament shift and split? So now what we're building on here is the ideas of really starting to understand more about what are the variables that we're starting to introduce into this idea of emotional algebra. When did those dichotomies change growing up? When did you start to see the world differently? And how does that enter also, like I said, not only into the way you play sport and express yourself, but, getting back to that analogy or the example of why I play games is I want to teach people how to win with grace and lose with grace. I want to teach people, remember those different types of respect. Treat people how you want to be treated. I think it's important to learn to be a gracious loser and, more importantly, to be a gracious winner. And in that, we start again to see the value of how do we get people to continue to want to continue to play, to challenge kids to want to continue to be better, not to feel like they're not good enough and quit. There's too many times I see people in life who would rather not play the game at all than play the game and lose. Sometimes this is part of their temperament and a characteristic we call resilience, and how do we bounce back from challenges. Sometimes I think in almost as much or more often, it becomes socialized, that idea of I quit. And I think that's what I see a lot of in some of the generations we have now. is because they haven't necessarily faced as much that idea of the harsh realities of winning and losing. I don't believe everybody should get a trophy in sports. I think participation of trophies, well, that's nice, but the participation we should feel inside. So what we've missed is that idea of building intrinsic motivation. Instead of having this trophy outside of myself, you know, a lot of people look at equity and think, well, you're one of those, everybody should get a trophy. Absolutely not. Because I want to encourage people to be their best, to always know that it's up to you to challenge yourself, and everybody outside of you is your teacher, as well as everybody outside of you may also be your student. So again, that's that do unto others. So when I teach people and I'm working with them on some of their issues, I'm going to be challenging for their best, and I'm going to give them their best. So for example, if we're playing a game, I say, you will beat me because you were better than me in that moment, because you learned and you excelled. And when you lose, you don't lose, you feel failure. Failure tells you when it's time to learn. That's the equity-based reason and purpose for failure. But in our hierarchical world, failure is seen as bad and wrong and weak, and you're a loser. And I think that's, again, really, really destructive.
Right. And so these are some concepts that not every child learns, maybe even most don't learn. And if they don't, how do these manifest later in life in much more complicated situations?
Well, I think what we're looking at in this situation is the idea of how do we use these dichotomies as tools versus weapons. You know, I think it was probably an oversight, but I always go back to the 1996 Olympics and in Atlanta. And I live in Atlanta. So when we went down for the Olympics, over the Georgia Dome at that time was a big, huge billboard that Nike put up that said second place is first loser. And even, you know, again, I've always taught this and, you know, about the dichotomies and understanding those things. And even though that was some time ago, I looked at the state of our culture at that time and the demand to win. And if you didn't win, you were a loser. Imagine all those other people from all those other countries that came, that left their families, that spent years and years and years of training, that just had they were their best in their country, maybe, or they had the opportunity to participate in these games that are really developed about bringing the best together to compete on this plane, to bring people together. And instead, what Nike did is they used it, to me, as a form of division without thinking about it. They might have felt they were encouraging better play. I disagree. And I think that to me was really kind of expressed the state of our country in many ways. And people can say, well, we've achieved what we've achieved of our country because our unwillingness to compromise, our unwillingness to accept second best. That's great. You can still do that in an equity environment. You can still challenge people to be their best. And if we started that when kids were young, and we continue to foster that, then we could see that people will grow into that in time through that process of learning and understanding. Fear is a very powerful emotion that can really change people very quickly. The ability to help somebody redo that or relearn something else other than fear takes time. Look at why post-traumatic stress exists, because something happened in that person's life so powerful and resulted in this fear and terror, helplessness, potential guilt, shame, and over time, hopelessness, that then this combination of emotions released this or resulted in this diagnosis we call post-traumatic stress. It takes a long time to work through that and help people to understand that, to shift it. Whereas if we understood that life happened in ways to teach us things, to help us grow, the difference between life happening for us and life happening to us, then often we'd find that we can use what we see as these dichotomies as tools to learn and to grow, but not to have power over, but to use as tools to understand our motivations for behaviors in time that we can learn from and shift and change. And like I said, while we might want to be good and be seen as good, we don't have to be better than. While we might have our desire to be right and learn, we don't have to be more right than. We can find the areas where we can use our intelligence and our gifts and our ability to be incisive and insightful and express that with people rather than over people. And then we can all win. And that's what we're looking for, is the idea of how can we collectively win together.
Yeah. And you bring up that Nike slogan. I feel like that really had become that even, went beyond just being a slogan for Nike. I think it's just become a thing that I hear people say throughout life when you're talking about winning and losing. It's
Right.
just become like a catchphrase now,
Right. And how do people get to the win? And that's what I often say is people who want to be seen as strong get to the win by expressing their strength over others. People who want to get to the win, who want to be seen as good, they have to be better than others. People who want to get to the right, get to there by being more right. Now, what we have to look at also is there's combinations. Some people want to be good and right. Some people want to be strong and right. To me, people who want to be strong and right can often come across as righteous. They have to be more right than others, and they just can be kind of in your face. They can kind of be seen as know-it-alls. People can want to be seen as good and right, can also kind of be seen as know-it-alls. It's the way that they express their right and slide it in there rather than saying, I'm right, you're wrong. They often might be more passive aggressive in sliding the right in there. People want to be seen as good and strong and right. They're often, I see them as perfectionistic. And even when I talk about perfectionism with people, there's some people I really see as perfectionistic. And I say, but you don't even think you're good enough to be seen as a perfectionist. And they'll say, you're right. So in that, we have to look at all these different ways that our idea that we have to be better than others, more perfect than others, all these things set us up for a lot of the disruptions we have inside emotionally. They set us up with our belief systems that aren't functional or adaptive, and they really set up our culture for a lot in this whole thing. And I often come down back to the idea of, why do we fight wars? Well, this whole thing came up, and I used it back in 2008 during those elections. I was asked to be on CNN, and I was talking to the commentator, and I said, a political race is like a war. And the goal of the war is to win. And how do we win a war but to be the strongest? If I'm strongest and I win the war, then I define the good and the right of the culture. That's really what our political systems, it doesn't matter the country, and often they come down to is that idea of win, and often win at all costs. And often we don't elect the best person. We elect the person who we think will advance things, or the person who looks stronger, or expresses strength, or meets the requirements or the desires of the constituency in that time. But also we look at the wars that we're seeing around the world right now, the wars within our own country. All these battles that are coming up are all about winning. It's not about listening. Wars become about submission to the victor. And when we do that, we stop listening. We stop seeking understanding. We're looking again to usurp, to undermine, to look to other people to see who's going to agree with us. Also in that, we have to look at how do we change our message to continue to maintain that power over the wars. So we could go throughout history and look at how the Roman Empire conquered, and how they often also look to conquer the hearts and minds of those by what they, when you had the Holy Roman Empire, started to integrate the ideas of Christianity in with different pagan beliefs and things. And you can look at how then that sometimes that changed, and how the Mongolians fought, and what happened in World War II and what happens now. And either way, it hasn't changed over time in the idea of how we win and lose, but it's important to really understand that when it gets into a winner and a loser, there's going to continue to be conflict, because then you're going to have those that we're going to talk about in the next episode that want to continue to undermine, and the different ways that they do that through the roles that we play. But here today, I think we really want to look at what are the contexts that we use these dichotomies, and how are they really, the way we see them and use them, really destructive in the world we live in today.
And I think as you described it there, you're talking about literal wars from history going all the way back to the Roman Empire. But I'm even thinking as you're talking about the culture wars of today. A lot of what you're saying, I think, applies. People not listening, people just trying to win a certain point of view and make
Right.
that right, as you say, or good.
Well, you know, even this recently, I was sitting with a group of people, and we started to have a discussion. And it was a discussion that one of the person really knew their stuff. They understood the issues that we were talking about, and the other person was semi-educated about it, but didn't really know as much as the other person. So what happened is once the person realized that it probably wasn't going to work out in their favor in the discussion, they started swearing. They got up and walked out, and it became this whole thing where I'm going to use strengths to try to be more powerful than you, and I'm going to win. And if I don't win, and right in that idea of what was known, what the facts were prevailed over what the person wanted to believe, then they just walked away. So there wasn't a discussion. It was an all or nothing situation. So too often when we're having discussions, and I'll tell you, even I run into this situation, I think it's, again, I try to be transparent, that I run into those situations where, yes, I want to be right. Yes, I have grown up in this hierarchical culture. And yes, I'm always going to aspire to try to be equity and own my stuff. So when we get in that place and we feel like we have to be right, and if somebody differs from us, we stop listening, we lose such valuable discourse. We lose the ability to learn more. And then our ignorance, which is choosing to not know, and our arrogance is what we, which is really a false pride of the things that we really don't even realize we don't know sometimes. Those issues start to really clash with our ability to continue to progress. So even if whether we want to be the most powerful country, greatest country in the world, or whether we just want to be a group of people that can really rise to the highest occasion and work together, our discourse, public discourse right now is really going to leave us in the dust because we're not finding ways to really work together to find ways to progress. And that's what we understand is how and why do we feel those people? So one of the things that I also look at here in our political discourse is what are the dichotomies of people who tend to be Republican? I see them as wanting to get to the win by looking strong and right. I look at people who tend to be Democrat as wanting to be seen as good and right. And how they express that, to me, Republicans, from variations on arrogance, Republicans tend to look brash. They tend to be in your face. This is the way it is. This is how we do it. And this is, this is what we're going to do. And this is why you suck. Democrats tend to be more smug. And I go back to Hillary Clinton in the 2016 elections. And, when she said the basket of deplorables, and that to me was so destructive and alienated so many people because it let people know that she was out of touch. There are a lot of disparities between people we have to recognize in how they see the world. And if she had reached out to those people and said, why do you feel the way you feel? What do you feel like we are doing that you are missing? Why do you feel there's this difficulty with trust in what our agenda is? And how can we help to meet some of those needs? Because they govern the whole country, not just the Democratic constituency. So we have to realize as soon as we feel like we are going to force our ideas down other people's throats, and unfortunately, in many ways, that's kind of become what the political discourse is, we're going to lose that idea of being and living up to our potential of what we created this country to be versus what it becomes. So again, what do I see as a country is the separation between our ideal and our real. And what's driving that discrepancy is our collective feel.
Right. And that was a situation, I think, where you're talking about, you described it as smug, but also it seemed like there was some, good versus bad to talk about your dichotomies here, right? I think she was suggesting that the basket of deplorables are bad people And
Exactly.
and looking at that dichotomy, which is hierarchical, right? This is a hierarchical dichotomy. Maybe wasn't the best thing for that moment particularly, but maybe isn't in general, as you're saying. One thing I thought you said, Dr. E, that was interesting is that you should aspire to be follow the equity-based model. You're not going to be perfect with that all the time, but at least aspiring to it will help you achieve that some of the time. Is that right?
Yeah. And I say every day we have the opportunity to do incrementally better. And that's what I want people to really see is what can I learn from today? So what went well? What could I learn from? And what can I do better in the future? And I think if we're constantly doing that every day, not to say I have to be perfect, because perfection is an aspiration. That's what we want to realize is all these things are things we're working towards, but why not do that? And when we say, well, that's not possible, I give up, that's no different than just a lot of the other people we see in the world we live around us, whether it's in sports or whether it's in trying to get a job or whether it's in feeling like they can have successful relationships. They're like, no, I'm good. And then inside it's that level of failure, stupidity, shame, guilt, inadequacy that they often hide from. But when going back to that example, it was a great example of the 2016 election. You bring attention to the comments that I did, and then the dichotomies that came with Hillary Clinton's comments, is when you called them bad and wrong, then their only option was to be seen as strong. And that comment resonated. Well, am I a deplorable? Am I a deplorable? Then they're all questioning themselves. What became the reaction was, forget you. I'm going to adhere to this belief even more because now you have told me I'm bad and wrong. How do I win? By looking strong. So if we look at what happens, like I said, look in our families, look in our communities. Why are the protests going on right now? Because people are trying to get to right, and being good and right and quiet protests weren't working. They felt that doesn't result in change. I have to be strong. And then the people who have done the other protests and justify themselves say, you're bad. Look at this horrible state of condition we're in, and look what you're allowing to happen. When we have to realize that the same people who are calling potentially for civil war are the same people who are criticizing these protests too. So I think what we have to look at is how we become hypocrites and how our hypocritical behavior continues to feed mistrust. We all want to feel heard. We all want to feel understood. We all, frankly, want to feel loved. And in this hierarchical world, it's you have it or you don't. You're good or you're bad. You're right or you're wrong. And if you're bad and wrong and weak, guess what? You're unlovable. You're unworthy. You're garbage. You're deplorable. You're all these things. And by viewing the world that way, that's where we're never going to find the world that we can create through continuing to aspire. So are people actually garbage? No. Do we feel that way? Yes. And that's where we want to seek to come to a place of understanding.
And just to recap and come away with some takeaways here, Dr. E, these dichotomies, all hierarchical, and all, I think what you're saying here is a matter of perspective. Also very simple, right? There's not a lot of nuance to this, right versus wrong, good versus bad, win versus lose. So there they are, right? But I think that you're going to tell us in the future that things are not so unnuanced or not so simple, and
Right.
and that we can do and understand more about how we interact with others, to influence better outcomes.
Well, I think even if we take the idea of dichotomies and we look at the examples, I think the universe has everything set up for us to learn the lessons we can learn just through the parallels between science and humanity. Is the sun doesn't pop up in the morning and then drop at night. The sun rises, and then it gets to the middle of the day, and then the sun sets, and then we have a twilight or a dusk, and then the sun sets and we have night. And so we have to realize that, to me, there's balance, there's equity, there's dimensionality to everything. So as long as we live and hold on to this idea of dichotomy, we're creating these filing cabinets within ourselves. And we'll go into this. This is kind of a teaser for a couple more episodes down the line, where we create these filing cabinets where we put our different experiences and emotions, and that become our beliefs and attitudes. And then what happens when they don't fit? When they don't fit, then we often feel like, well, I don't know what to do. And that creates more disruption. So if we realize that this might fit here, and this might fit here in this situation, and we see that there is no, to me, really many true right and wrongs. I don't want to say no, none. But when we look at there's dimensionality to all this, then like I said, we can look at all sides and we can acknowledge that, it's important for me to be willing to learn more here and to look at this and understand this and understand that everyone has value and nobody should be deemed a deplorable. To me, what you have is an issue of education and awareness and a lack of cultural acceptance for each other and where we all come from. And that's, to me, that great melting pot of this country and the great melting pot of this world, and not only understanding our culture and the people here, but also having understanding for other people's cultures and where they've come from.
And I really love the example you used of the sun, Dr. E, because really that describes how this is all a matter of perspective. Because in reality, the sun just sits in a fixed place in space, and it's the earth that moves around it and spins and gives us the sunrise and, the high noon and sunset and nighttime. So it's all a matter of perspective, which I think is a great way to think about these dichotomies, right? They are a matter of perspective, and looking ahead, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about some role playing, I think, in the next episode. Is it role playing, Dr. E?
Well, it's the roles people play. But you brought up a wonderful point, Andrew, and I do want to come back to it, because we got to remember back to Catholicism, when basically Catholicism, we say historically, was responsible for the Dark Ages. They deemed the earth to be the center of the universe, and the belief that the sun rotated around the earth, and that was the absolute center of this. That was the time when they set up absolute dichotomies between good and bad and right and wrong and strong and weak and win and lose. And they were the determiners. That Catholic Church was the determiners, that if you were bad and or wrong, you were going to die, or you were going to be jailed, or you were a heretic and you were excommunicated, and then you were known. And different cultures have done that in different ways. It still happens to this day. But the idea that in that time, they were set up absolute dichotomies, and now look where the Catholic Church has grown and look what they become. And that's where we got to recognize, is that through growth and through the courage of people, the Galileos, the Copernicuses, the Michelangelos, those people who challenged, and the Martin Luthers who, created new religions, who challenged that absolute authority, absolute hierarchical structure, and said, no, this doesn't work anymore. Our planet wouldn't be here where it is. Our level of technology wouldn't be here. And some of the theories are, imagine how much further our technologies and our cultures could be had there not been 1,000 years of Dark Ages. So, I refer back to that in that. And partly in that is a teaser to understand the roles that people play that we will talk about in our next episode. So again, I appreciate everybody who's participating. Your homework this week is to look back and recognize not only the dichotomy you might be coming from, good, bad, right, wrong, strong, weak, win, lose, and or the combination. Am I looking good and right, strong and right, good and strong, good, strong, and right? Look at those variations, and also be aware of what other people are using and how they might be expressing themselves in those dichotomies. So until next time, I look forward to seeing you all.
That's right. We'll see you again on Emotional Algebra with Dr. E.